Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Janine Irvine, toko ingoa no Timawawe tuku oku tipuna kei tēnā hu ki Tamaki Makaurau. So thank you for joining us here this afternoon. I acknowledge my ancestry to Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, and that I have been fortunate to be welcomed into the community of Aotearoa and Tamaki Makaurau specifically since I was a young adult. So I really spent most of my life here now. I'm here with you this afternoon to talk to you about local histories from perhaps a perspective you haven't actually considered before, and that is life writing. So I began my career as a social science researcher as a young graduate and evolved into oral history and life writing over the course of my career. I've been writing full-time since 2009 and only took a break from 2016 to 2020 to do my doctoral studies at Massey University. And although I was situated within the discipline of English and life studies especially, I was working interdisciplinary and collaboratively with the disciplines of history, sociology, and anthropology. So it's usually at this time that people ask me, well, what actually is a life writer and what is it that you do? So to put it in a really simple format, I work with people to research, record, preserve, write, and publish their stories. Whether those are their individual stories, their family histories, or community or organizational histories and stories. You can probably remember these sorts of works most specifically as biographies, autobiographies, memoirs, but there are actually dozens of genres that fall within this broad category of life writing. Because essentially it's just a biographical and an autobiographical mode of speaking and writing about our life experiences. So under this umbrella of work, I started to work on a particular project in 2010 in South Island, the Rakaya Community Story. They were writing a local history book, but interestingly wanted a life writer to work alongside them to facilitate that. So I wandered on down and spent a lot of time with the community for a number of years while we researched and wrote that project. And over that time, had a lot of learning to do myself about local history writing, and sought out advice and information from writers and project teams across the country and even further afield. The more questions I started to ask, the more fascinated I came by this kind of history storytelling that I was watching firsthand. And I wanted to look really more closely at the storytelling or the lived experiences that people were so eager to share with researchers and writers in these books and have them published in these collections. I felt when I spoke to readers and community members that it was these stories, these memories, these shared memories that really resonated with them when they read the publications. But interestingly enough, it's these same memories and stories that for academic historians is somewhat more bothersome, because the stories and the memories that were being shared are often quite a step away, shall we say, from formal evidence-based practices and critical interpretations, and they lean more heavily into a personal storytelling space. But this is what was interesting to me, because I felt that in the space of storytelling, we got to the community stories, the literature of communities. And I felt that the books and the projects that create them could be both a history record and a form of community literature. So I started to look closely at the life writing features of local history book projects. And I thought that maybe if we knew a little bit about these projects from this literary perspective, it could complement the work that historians were doing in Aotearoa especially to improve the scholarship of the research, writing, and publications of these community publications. So these are just a couple of examples of some of the projects that I worked on, and the Rakaya project, as I said, the stimulus for the research that I did. In the research, I spent a lot of time looking at various projects and book projects across the country, both in Aotearoa, the Pacific, and across the globe. I concentrated my research on New Zealand with one case study in the Pacific, and I wanted to look at these kind of group stories of local history. So what I did is I spent a lot of time thinking about the memories, the stories, the history storytelling side of local history writing. I wanted to consider how we researched and wrote about the experiences we associated with the places that we felt were home or places that we emotionally belonged to. In addition to looking at a wide range of publications and projects, I wanted to spend time on particular case studies. So I focused on particular projects that had a community-centered approach, meaning they were books that were written from community members. They were driven by processes and practices in the community. It's really a collaborative style of writing and researching. And then I spent a lot of time talking to many more producers of these books from different types of backgrounds, both academic scholars, professional historians, and community group projects were largely made up of untrained or newcomers to history writing in general. And my research dovetailed into the usual PhD thesis, which, as proud as I am of it, I realized there are very few people in the world who actually want to take the time to sit and read through those 300 pages, my partners included. And I knew that we wanted to find ways to share these incredible learnings that people were so welcomely and happily sharing from their professional experiences. So we produced, together with some of the people who were involved in my PhD research, this e-publication called The Stories of Places in 2021. It's an attempt to share some of the observations and learnings of looking at local histories as a type of group storytelling or life writing. And I'm going to share and speak to just some of those observations with you here today. There's so much more that I could share, so I've tried to cherry pick the things I think would be most interesting. If there's something that you would like more information on, feel free to stop me afterwards, have a chat, and we can always follow up or follow through. And the book, as we said, is also available online. Despite all of this time spent in research, or perhaps because of it, I stand here saying that I have a lot more to learn, a lot to relearn, to uncover, to discover, and to relearn eventually. So when I come to talks like this, it's to facilitate, I hope, a conversation of learning amongst us, a chance to learn from one another and our experiences. I do want to emphasize upfront that local history is far richer than just local history books. Local histories are varied, they are dynamic, they include things like place names, oral histories, oral traditions, performative art, songs, music, dance, sculptures, creative art forms. There are so many ways that that local histories manifest for us. But because of my research and the focus on books as only one format, it's to books that I'm speaking today. Now, the first thing that really fascinated me when I started to spend more time with local history writing is just how popular these projects are in New Zealand. I was quite overwhelmed at the numbers of these books and publications that have been produced in 150 years. And interestingly, despite changing trends, how they've never waned in popularity. And it's helpful, I think, to have a bit of background as to where these books come from or why they're written the way they are. Local history books were established as a colonial settler tradition from the mid to late 19th century in New Zealand. This was a practice that was well established by settler colonies in the Americas, Africa, Australia. So it was no surprise at all that the same practice of writing came to New Zealand. It was a way of settlers writing back about their experiences, how they were creating and building new homes for themselves and their families. The books were generally written by ex-military, newspapermen, clergy, and teachers, but within a short space of time, we found many more people from the communities, community leaders and organizations wanting to write and publish some of these books. Many of them more in the format of pamphlets than actual books, but as technology evolved, the contents became a lot more book format. And of course, based on the time they were written, they were understandably largely Pakeha-centric, developing a form of colonial settler history, most of them outside formal academic scholarship, and publications hit an all-time peak at the time of the centennials, as we would expect. And although publications might have lowered after the 10 or so years after, they picked up again considerably. Now, over the space of 100 years from the 20th century, there were a lot of changes to local history and local history writing. And last week, Dr. Carol Neal she offered a wonderful presentation of the changes of local history. So I'm not going to repeat that here, but I'd encourage you to seek out that recording when it's available to listen to that. Really, the key changes to how local history was written was influenced by the rise of social history from the 1960s, the big impact of Maori scholarship and leadership in talking about pre-colonial history of tangata whenua, and the public's willingness to engage more with questions of whakapapa and pepeha and the significance of place names. We also had the rise of professional historians leaving academic institutions and working within community settings, and the work of scholars like Jim Gardner in the late 20th century who worked tirelessly to improve the standard of local history writing, to improve the scholarship of how we produce these books. So local history over a space of 120 or so years evolved to a far more inclusive and critical dialogue space, not just the recording of dates from a settler's point of view. And it included a critique of Western traditions of local history writing. We saw more creative ways of telling local histories from the late 20th century and now definitely into the 21st century. And many of these publications have shifted into a very strong storytelling mode with a reclaiming of local voice, which as a life writer, I find quite exciting. From the 1980s, for example, we saw a huge rise in numbers of local histories being written from the Indigenous perspective, writing back to critique the traditions of settler writing from the past. And it's within that space that I thought there was research possibility of looking at how we could have these records of history and these community literatures expressing different worldviews. And life stories and life writing helps us to look at that through that particular literary lens. Local history books are still mostly written outside of formal academic interests, and they are largely self-published. We have such wide access to technology and skills today than previously. So it's a lot easier for people who are interested in researching or looking through archives to spend time looking into the stories of local places and writing about them. For researchers and writers, regardless of their backgrounds, we know that there is a strong interest in both the evidence that's presented as well as the personal stories. The personal stories are really presented in this memory format, the memories that people share about special events that took place in local places. It could be an earthquake, it could be a flood, it could be a special centennial celebration, or an event of significance like a flooding of a river in Rakaya that had a big impact on how the community developed in a certain time and space. People like to share memories about activities and experiences that they had, going to school, certain businesses, buildings, common places, clubs, recreational activities. And all these memories form the shared story, or the life story, if you will, of local places. And it's this story around which we craft the facts and evidence from the archives. For writers, if we consider these books then through this lens of life writing as a type of group history or storytelling, it reveals some of the personality or the quirks of local history writing, which as writers or would-be writers, we actually do need to pay attention to. The first is, for me, a real strong emphasis that these books and the projects that create them are personal and relational. The stories that are shared, the memories that are offered and conveyed in these books and the stories we tell of local histories provoke emotion and a reaction because we connect to one another through our stories. The stories shared of our family, our neighbors, our friends, our forebears, they resonate with us. So the books and the stories that we try to tell through them, even as history records, matter on a personal and emotional level. They can facilitate an imaginative homecoming of sorts, and they can strengthen for readers this connection or sense of belonging with local places. But on the alternative, if the stories and the memories shared in the publications do not represent your experiences, they can trigger a sense of alienation and displacement for some readers. A second feature of these books through life writing is to remember that the processes, when we start looking into local histories and talking to people about their stories, it triggers and facilitates this wonderful experience of memory sharing. This time of remembering or sharing of stories is usually a sincere remembering of events. But sincere doesn't mean perfect, because we need to bear in mind as the researchers and writers that memories can be faulty and fallible. This is the messy stuff for historians of contradicting different memories. And if you think about your own memories and you have a family gathering and you take 10 of your family relatives and you ask them to remember an event from 20 years ago, you might have 10 different versions of the same event that you're all present at. See, writing about our lived experiences, writing about local histories these ways, it represents a time of looking back from a time of the present. So we are reinterpreting the past with our present day insight. It's not something objective that we set out as writers or researchers to uncover. It is actually something that emerges during the time of remembering and retelling and interpreting of evidence. A key feature, though, for life writing, and a reason why I feel it's very relevant to studying and thinking about local history books, is that these types of articulations of life experiences, they speak back to a context. So our lived experiences speak to a historical, geographical, socioeconomic, cultural, and political context, always. Local history books and their projects, therefore, are always political. And in New Zealand, these books speak back in different ways to colonisation, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and decolonisation. They cannot be a neutral text. They are part of a much bigger social conversation. So for researchers and writers, we need to understand that these books and the projects that we might trigger or become involved with are part of a way bigger community conversation with its own past. For writers and researchers, then, it actually asks us to consider that there are social responsibilities associated with writing the stories of a geographical group. And there are three key things that I think that writers and would-be writers need to take note of when we think about local history writing from a literary point of view. The first is the point of view. So when you're writing any story, any lived experience or life story, it comes through the lens of a person looking at an experience, an event, an activity. They're speaking from a situated position. Now, one way that I can illustrate that is in my research, and it's covered in the ebook publication of Stories of Our Places, is a great example of a publication called Mātaongi Tokelauā. That is the community written history and anthropological approach to history writing of the Tokelauā community. And in the 1990s, they published first a Tokelauan version and in 1991 an English translation. There's a great story there in their community records or archives about a solar eclipse that took place in the early 1950s, where they write about the event from the point of view of the Tokelauan community living on the atolls. The same event is documented by the Western scientists who came and stayed on the atolls during the time and wrote about the eclipse. And if, as you as a scholar, take the two versions of the same event and put them side by side, you see completely different points of views of people present at the same event, at the same place, at the same time. So as a writer and a researcher, it really helps us to think about the second step, which is how do we convey that point of view? So as a writer, when I'm thinking about putting my research together into a history story, I'm also conscious of the voice of narration that I use to tell the story. So who is the narrator in your books or your publications? Is it an attempted third-person, objective, omnipresent wave sitting above the story? Or is it the personal story of people or peoples from within the community? One publication which I loved studying in my research was a little-known book called Mochiroa, A Social History. That's produced by the Harris brothers from Taranaki, and it's available, I think, in the Auckland Library system too. And in that publication, the writers set out to do something quite unique. They decided if they were writing local history, not only would they do the research of local history, but they would present it in a way that actually sounded like community history. And they present this wonderful poetic cacophony of voices, of just stories that don't need to be neatly reconciled or condensed, but just sit alongside one another in a depiction from their point of view of what community history sounds like when you're talking at grassroots. A third key aspect of writing, when we're thinking about local history writing through life writing practices, is to be quite considerate of the narrative arch. So the narrative arch is really the storytelling capacity of any history. So as we gather all of our records and our evidence, all of it, as interesting as it might be, needs to make sense to your reader. So we can't just throw everything into relevant chapters and ask people to make sense of it. As a writer, one of our responsibilities is to construct a story of history around the evidence and these shared stories. But this is where it's interesting. And this is where social responsibility shows itself. Because the work we do in constructing that story, that thematic art of how we create a beginning, a middle, and an end, it has social implications. Most local histories, you'll see, don't actually have a definitive end. Most local histories point towards the future as a bit of an open-ended, let's see what happens next. But they start from a point of time, and they follow patterns of themes as we try to explain what's happened in the communities and why. In traditional local history writing of the older books that we saw from, let's say, the mid to late 19th century, even into the mid 20th century, the settler trope would have dominated and can still do as a default. The idea of a narrative of prosperity, of coming to create something new, something that we can pass on to future generations. But think about how that sits alongside a narrative for tangata whenua in same places where people have experienced dispossession of land. And that narrative arch is one of dispossession, displacement. So as a writer, being aware of these different arcs of narrative is really important for us to consider. While all of these things are buzzing around in the head of a writer, there's two real practical things that come up and stump us every time. Seemingly little things which make the world of difference to how we shape the histories, how our readers read them, how they can interpret them, and how they can engage with the content. So writers, we encourage them as a life writing practice to think reflexively about these matters. And the first is that dreaded word count. If anyone has even attempted history, whether it's your own writing or a community's writing, you will know that within months, you will be drowning in material. You will have boxes, more content and evidence and stories than you can ever condense into one publication. So the writer is left with a very difficult task of deciding who are you going to include in these stories? How are you going to select some content over others? And how do you reduce what could possibly be 20 publications to one 200 copy book? Now in Rikaya, to push the limits, I really pushed the limits. We got a story of 750 pages. It's more coffee table than coffee table book. And every publisher we went to almost lost their marbles at the thought of trying to produce a book with a spine that big. We were determined to get as much in as we could. And even then, there are dozens of boxes of material. that we couldn't include in that project. The problem with this is, while we're doing this wonderful critical work of trying to include different points of view and narrations, while we're trying to think extensively about experiences, we still only have a certain word count. So as writers are writing, they are faced with leaving material out, and meaning that sometimes significant narratives, significant topics and interpretations are reduced to one chapter or one subsection, when we know that in terms of community history, that topic and conversation actually warrants so much more detail and discussion. The second slightly problematic thing I've found is seemingly small words have actually large implications for how we read local histories and how they're interpreted. There is the dreaded the and we, which trip us up in local history writing. The is an assertive position of writing, and this is something that often comes up in the titles of history books. So consider, for example, the history of Auckland versus a history of Auckland. One asserts an authoritative position, this is the official record, and one opens up space for dialogue. So as writers, it actually behooves us to spend time thinking about that small difference with big implications. The problematic we is equally troublesome, because the temptation in writing a local history is that we actually write about a collective experience, and we adopt the pronoun of we very readily. So even if we have a third-person narrator, a lot of storytellers might speak in the collective, we did this, we experienced that. The temptation comes, I think, because with storytellers, they are sharing these stories and memories so readily with research teams that researchers know that they're being entrusted with this wonderful, rich collection of memories and anecdotes and stories. But we need to also bear in mind that for everyone who's sharing stories, there might be people who are choosing to keep their stories and memories private, or choosing to share them with other audiences other ways. So the we struggles to represent that fully diverse community. And I have to be honest, as a writer, this is not something I have yet resolved. I think we're all still grappling with this. We understand that local spaces are diverse, and they evolve with each new storyteller who steps forward to share their experiences, sometimes in sharp contrast to already published experiences. In the past, Pakeha narratives, particularly in traditional writing, have certainly dominated this space, and this has been challenged to include more multiple narratives today in the type of writing that we're seeing evident. So what do we do then? Given these literary complexities of storytelling for local history books, what can we take from this? Well, I reckon once we start to look at local history book projects as a group story, as a representation of people, many different people who call this place home, it requires writers and would-be writers to think through questions of ethics and practices, especially authorship and representation, with extreme care. One way that we can really address this most successfully, I think, is through a collaborative, community-centered approach to writing. The way that we can facilitate and encourage community discussions about our local histories. And there have been some wonderful examples of how projects have been able to do this through creating local roundtables, coffee shop meetings, really opening up the space of talking about our shared stories and being willing to listen to one another for stories that are different. An important part of collaborative research then allows us, rather than to write as individual writers in a silo, to engage with these community stories at different levels. Perhaps to have project groups that include historians, professional writers, community leaders, iwi representatives from different community sectors. And these are quite difficult things sometimes to get our head around. But if it is something that's of interest to you, I'd encourage you to come along to our workshop in a month's time on the 1st of October, because here is where we'll work through some of these experiences and practical ways of doing the sort of work in a slightly different collaborative way. And this isn't based on anything other than people's actual project experiences, things they wish they'd learned before they got started, but as most experiences is learned along the way, and are really eager to share with other writers in the future. Of course, a great place to start, if you are on your own journey of history writing, is please forge a relationship with a historian. When I was a newcomer to history writing, I found that working with historians was the most important thing I could do. And historians in New Zealand, whether they are academic historians working within the universities or professional historians working within FANZA or NOHANS or in other community-based history roles, are accommodating in ways that is very encouraging for writers in this space. There's some wonderful work by the late Gavin McLean, for example, How to Do Local History. It's a wonderful publication, I think, that really helps get you on your way, but nothing beats, I think, actually a sit down, coffee, face-to-face with somebody who can give you some great advice and guidance. Because of all of these experiences of all of these writers, what they came up with in our research and our discussions with one another is encouraging us to ask a whole lot of critical questions before we start the projects, before we get writing. So no matter where you are on your stage of writing, you can stop, take a pause, reflect, and do some of the thinking work. If you're thinking about a project, this is a great time to ask some of these questions. And it's not just about you as the writer or the project facilitator, it's also you facilitating other people in the project team and the wider community to have some of these conversations with you. So there are key things that I think we could be asking here. The first starts with you asking, what's my story? Before reaching out to tell the stories of others, to think about our story. What's my history? What's my connection to this place? And to spend time thinking through that personal lens and that personal experience, because it does influence how you approach the project and what it is that you're going to do. The second is to spend a lot of time, as much as you can, understanding the wider context of the place. And that's knowing the history, the socio-cultural, the economic, and the political background to a place before you start engaging with the stories of the place, to have that interpretive context available for you. I think as a writer, it's really important to ask yourself about the intention of a book project. Like, why exactly is that book being written? Who is it being written for and why? And to be transparent about that. Local history books are actually really good at doing this. And if you look at most local histories, there's a foreword or an afterword, sometimes both. And in almost every project that I studied and every book I read, there is some discussion about who commissioned the project, what approach was taken, what period of time was covered. So as writers, we're communicating that with readers and helping readers then to understand contextually, where is this book situated? I think writers also need to ask some difficult questions of themselves. And that's what I call asking the right question, which is, am I the right person to write the story? Is this the right time to tell the story for the community? And as a book lover, the hardest one of all, is a book the right format for the story? Our next step thing is to consider the approach that we're going to use in writing, and that's the encouraging ways of conversation. How are we going to get as many people as possible within the community to stop, talk, have dialogue, think about our histories, share our histories? And I'm going to swap onto my oral history hat here, because this is the perfect time in planning to think about how you can use that wonderful, rich time of interviewing and talking to have an oral history project that sits alongside the local history project. Because as you're doing all of this great work of recording or writing down notes, if you can capture it as another format of history, it just enriches and uses the time and resources so much wiser. I think the key thing from local history writing, when you look at it from a community storytelling perspective, is it gives us space and encourages us to think about breaking the mold. to taking the books of old and doing something new with them, to challenging some of the ways they were written, and to think about how do we write the stories of places that are meaningful to a people and these places, the people they call home. So I have a blank page as my final slide for us this afternoon for many reasons. One is that there are many blank pages sitting in front of many writers around the country, writers who are grappling with how do we then convey these multiple narratives? How do we think about these different perspectives, which is our Pakeha settler history, Maori history, and the more recent migrant histories of groups who've come to call New Zealand home. Local history writing today encourages us to ask more stories about more places. It suggests that we don't assert one over another, and we think about how do we then accommodate multiple narratives. But to do this sort of work, it does require some careful consideration, and I do believe that the practice and disciplines of life writing could help us actually meet that challenge head on. Not only are we seeing exciting new formats, we are seeing writers do things with publications, using images and writing and personal stories to convey local histories in unexpected ways. And I can think of just two that jump out to me of more recent publications, like The Observation of a Rural Nurse by Sarah McIntyre or Lucy McIntosh's Shifting Grounds, books that they might not necessarily have set out to write as local histories, but who convey and capture local histories and community stories in such an incredibly creative, scholastically rich, but also storytelling-wise, that inspires us to think about how can we do this differently? How can we write so that we're not defaulting to an old staid style of writing? I think we are seeing a lot of critique of different styles. We are seeing decolonization of formats, which I think is deeply inspiring for all of us. But perhaps the most exciting change for local history writing, I think, will be the changes in our history curriculum, where we see more students engaging critically with the questions of local histories. We will see an increase of skills, hopefully, from our students and our teachers, and it opens up a space for more discovery and conversation ahead. I think that when we look at the next centennial, the bicentennial publications, we'll have a collection of writing that is in sharp contrast to the writings from 100 years ago. And I, as a reader and lover of books, am very excited to see what these writers bring forth. And I just want to end really with an encouragement to say, there are many, many more local histories that could be and should be written, but how we write them, it is going to matter. I'll end there for us today and say, if you're interested in more, join us at our workshop.
Oh, Janine, thank you very much. That's an incredible depth of thought about the contemplation and the writing of local history. I can tell that you had good reason to write an entire book to collect those thoughts, which I'm sure will be very valuable to budding local history writers. And I'll encourage anyone who's interested to sign up for that workshop. I imagine that numbers will be limited. We do have some time for questions now. I'll ask that if you have a question, you ask one question, and to allow other people to ask their questions as well. There may be time for further discussions after we've completed the talk. I can see we've got one hand raised at the front here, so I'll just pass the microphone over now.
Kia ora. Thanks so much, Janine. That was really fascinating. I wonder if you can comment on the issue of it. It struck me as I was listening to you that perhaps the reading of the local history is not the point. It's actually the collaboration and the telling of the story collaboratively that is empowering for the community. You know, it's the sort of journey, not the destination idea, which sort of is a bit counterintuitive if you're talking about a book, right? But the end product actually isn't really it. I wonder if you could comment on that idea.
Sure. That's a great question and a really good observation, because part of the research that we looked at was spending a lot of time to ask about what was the significance of the books. And the first thing that struck out was exactly that while the books do form like Tonga, they are treasured, they are enjoyed, and sometimes the books provoke a lot of debate and dialogue within the community. The thing that actually really mattered most was the process of being part of that conversation. So it was the journey of learning and thinking about one another's stories. And I think that's why the idea of it being a community-centered approach is so important. It can't just be about a writer coming to tell the story and then producing a book. It's what happens, this wonderful, rich process. That is community storytelling. The sitting together, the talking, the learning, and then being able to take that chance of letting somebody tell a history that's not your history, and then working out that space together to, I think, appreciate, and I've seen this done in communities, how when they can have that conversation, my history doesn't have to be the same as your history, but collectively that actually forms our history. And it's that time of discovery, that the process of writing, which I think is really significant in local history book projects. The book is the cherry on the top, so to speak, but it's everything that comes before that, which is why everything that we do, it actually really matters. It informs like what it is that we're going to produce too. So the more communities are participating, the more likely the book is going to stray from the official third person, I'm telling you this is the expert, to that open space of storytelling. I'll fight back the example of the Mataroa project because I really encourage you. It's a little tiny book, and I spent heaps of time with Don and Noel Harris, but they set up this process, a really informal process of gathering stories, and it just snowballed into this collection. And then the understanding that the publication was affirming to people to read, but it was the ability to spend that time sharing, talking, approaching someone, having the conversation, and then knowing that someone was listening to the conversation and doing something with it. That's where local history became rich in their community's experience.
Question at the front.
Kia ora, thanks, Janine. As somebody who works in the kind of collecting, archiving side in libraries, it occurred to me, we were talking about, how you manage word count. How do you deal with all of that when you're creating this? And of course, I would encourage people to think about how they maintain and collect the primary research, whether it be people's, letters, diaries, or the oral histories and things that you collect along the way, as part of the record of whatever is created, so that future researchers who will be reading just the book can, if they were interested in the context of where that's come from, they could go back to those wider resources. But of course, that's can be very burdensome for somebody for institutions in terms of collecting, but also for individuals in their garage days. And I wondered whether, you had a system around that.
Another really good question. And without saying the same thing, that is actually one of the aspects of publication that we'll talk about in the workshop, because in order to make the material count, it does require you to have a plan as you're gathering it. Because what often happens is at the end of a project, anyone written a local history book here? Anyone attempted? It's exhausting. It takes a lot longer than you think. It requires a lot more resources than you think. So there's this thing in local history writing that we call project fatigue. And then what often happens after the book's published, the writer and the project team is exhausted. So they just shut all the stuff in their garage and walk away and think, I'll attend to it later, and never do. So instead, from people's experiences, we really advocate for having a project plan as you get started, so that you're not just gathering haphazardly, but you actually have a research plan as to what you're going to do with that material. And that is working with a local repository, whether a museum or a library. That's particularly thinking through those interviews, as I said. So not just all writers take their dictaphones or their recorders. and they sit down and they do it, and it's like, oh, at the end they think, oh, maybe I should have done it as an oral history project at the same time. So with a bit of prior planning, it helps us to think, as we're gathering all of these records, as we're documenting them, we're creating an archive that we can then lodge somewhere, because you're only publishing like this much, and there's all of this wonderful material that lies underneath. So in the projects I've been involved with, we've been very strong about what do we do next, and putting time aside to archive it, to organize it, to lodge it somewhere. But having a plan makes it easier to do rather than coming back when you're absolutely exhausted and have no time or money.
Excellent. Do we have any questions from the Zoom, Brent? No. Excellent, excellent.
Thank you for joining us.
I don't see any more hands up, and I think we've had a very healthy discussion. So I will allow us to end on that note. Janine, thank you very much for speaking. It was an excellent talk, and we're grateful that you're offering your experience and knowledge in this upcoming workshop.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.